Hello and welcome to the latest installment in our UXDX Online series. I hope you're really excited about the event that we have lined up for you tonight. I know I'm eager to hear the stories that our speakers have to share. But before we jump into that, I want to give a very quick introduction to what it is we do at UXDX and why we host these sessions. So at UXDX, our mission is to help companies shift from building software through projects to autonomous empowered product teams. And the reason why that is our mission is because we believe it's a more effective, efficient, and sustainable way of building software products. But only, and this is one of the challenges, is that the context is always different in different organizations. So in some cases, projects are the best approach. And that's when you're in a low change environment. But a lot of us today aren't in the kind of situation where you just have one or two projects a year. I've been in places they have 120 projects going on at any given time. And in that case, it makes more sense to have people who really understand the customer, the business needs in a much smaller niche area of your entire product. And they can then improve and iterate on that. So the talks that we have today and across all of our series is to kind of dig into different parts of the product development lifecycle and figure out how are you supposed to kind of adopt this new way of working? Because it's very easy to say it, but it's a lot more difficult to try change your organization and adopt some of these new ways of working. So hopefully, as people are giving their talks, you'll come up with some questions, maybe particular to your context. So please do feel free to write those questions either in YouTube chat or in the chat on uxdx.com or wherever you're watching this from. And we'll pass those questions along to the speakers. But sometimes we don't actually have enough time to get through everything. So that's why we have the UXDX community Slack group. And in there, we have one channel called Ask the Speakers. So any questions that we don't get time to answer today, we'll post them in there and we'll invite the speakers to come in and answer the questions there as well. But that's enough about me. You're not here to listen to me talk. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker this evening. So bear with me a second. And our first speaker today is going to be Yann, and he is the CEO of UX Design. And he was talking about making user research in Africa accessible and iterative. So welcome, Yann. And over to you. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for having me today. It's a pleasure joining you to share about what we're passionate about, which is doing user research on the African continent. I'm not sure you've seen a lot of people doing user research or UX in Africa so far, so I'll try to summarize the way we do it in our design agency, but also some of the learnings and the tools that we built along the way to help us do that and make it accessible. There is a lot. We've been in business for 6 years, building this community from Senegal. So if we don't have the time to cover everything, please drop some question. I'll be very happy and excited to chat with you afterwards. So a bit about me, you can read, but the most important maybe to remember is that I've been here for quite a while and always frustrated by how startups in the tech world seems to copy-paste models that come from the Western world. And naturally, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because the usage, the behaviors that we see on the African continent are very peculiar and change a lot per country, or even city per city. So I'm really passionate about making tech more accessible and relevant for the African continent. And we've been building this company 6 years ago to solve that issue. You can follow us online. I love to still do UX research myself and write about it, but also write about how we build a design and research company on this continent. So why we created this company in the first place is to make sure that people can project themselves in a future where their needs, their identity and culture is represented in the technology that they will use on a daily basis. This is why for us it's very important to make research and to make design accessible so that everyone can do it by themselves and more people can actually ask users for the right thing to build. And then in the end, create product out really tailored to the African context. We started like this, a bit of our story, because it touched a lot about what we want to make, why we want to make it accessible and iterative. But this is how it started. It's basically us, with my co-founder over here that you see with the t-shirt, sharing with a group of people talking about user research, talking about UX design. And this is how it started from Senegal 6 years ago. And users research has been central to us since the beginning. And this is a picture of one of our colleagues doing user research with street vendors at a time. That's fascinated us to see that in the informal economy, there is a lot of people that actually are very central to everything we buy and do on a daily basis, but the use of digital is totally unknown. And for us, it was very interesting to start digging into this community of street vendors and understand what could be the potential needs for digital solution. We launched a first app that was a huge failure. It never worked. It was for educational content. But building this first app, we actually realized there was an opportunity to build a product that can have them, the street vendors themselves, doing user research for others. And this is the tool we built that is called Luca. I'm going to come back on it more in detail today, but this is how it all started. And for us, this is really about making research accessible and in the end of everyone. So today, we are a bit bigger than when it started. So we are a team of around 40, 42 full-time people across different countries on the continent. As you know, this continent is very, very big. And covering it all for us has been a challenge culturally and in terms of logistics and so many of the things about building a company. But that's not a topic of today. But basically, very excited that we've been able to work with top brands like Google, Wikipedia, or Meta or Square across the few years that we've been in business, but also a lot of big NGOs for which we do projects on education, on healthcare, on agriculture, so that we can also have a huge social impact doing all the methodology that we are passionate about. The third tier of clients we're very excited to work with is the local startups. And I'll come back a lot on that today, because actually, if we want to make research accessible and iterative, it's mostly for them. They are the ones who don't really have the means to pay an agency all the time. This is why building tools that could be tailored and adapted for them to do research on the continent has been part of our mission since the beginning. Why making research accessible in Africa? For us, it's just a matter of understanding better the context. As you may know, there is almost no data whatsoever that exists on most of the users over here. It's not like you can go on Statista, just download it, and you have a beautiful data already. It doesn't work like that over here. It's very opaque, and it's very hard to find reliable data. Literacy is very low, and digital literacy as well. So you always need to understand your user on a very specific basis, so case-by-case basis. Otherwise, you may totally fail building and launching a digital product. Connectivity is still an issue in urban cities and rural areas, notably. But this is why you need to really take on a case-by-case basis and do more research to understand if there is any barrier to adoption to your service. And last but not least, in general, people here don't trust organization. This is why you don't have a lot of room for error when you launch a product. People will take you for very seriously, and if you fail satisfying them, they will put you on the side very rapidly and not ever coming back. This is why you need to get it right quite rapidly. But more importantly for us, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's about giving a voice. It's about making sure people, cultures, behavior, identity is actually reflected in the product they will use on a daily basis. So to understand a bit better about what we actually do, we did for the second year this year, a big study that is public and free on the state of user research. And this is from those type of studies that we can actually understand what are the things that are needed for the design and UX research community on the continent. Few stats so that you get a bit into the head of a UX researcher in Africa. So how often do companies do user research here? As you can see, it's not often. Most of the companies do it less than monthly, and most of them, don't do it more than quarterly or 3 times a year. Naturally, it doesn't mean this is very accessible and very iterative. There is really something to solve over here to make it a bit more continuous. How is user research done? So basically, what methods are UX researchers or designers doing on the continent? And I'd love to get your feedback or how it compares to your different markets. But a lot of people focus on usability tests or individual interviews, which is great, but for them, it's been really a challenge organizing those. Naturally, survey and quantitative studies are done, but I'm not sure they're done very well, because in the study that we also have the tools, most of the people use Google Form and not necessarily trained about the right way to do quantitative research. And so a lot of wrong data are actually coming out of this research. So what are the main challenges people face doing the research? And as you can see, the links directly to the accessibility and the fact of doing research on a continuous basis. So first is sourcing the right participants. As you can guess, finding people who are reliable, available, connected, of different profiles is really, really hard on this huge continent with so much diversity of profiles and behaviors. Second is the time availability. Companies here have resource constraints for most of them, and so they don't have a full stack research team available. So it's mostly one researcher, or sometimes the UX designer, that has to do everything by himself, maybe with the help of the product manager. So time availability is definitely a constraint. And this is actually following some of this constraint that we noticed 4 or 5 years ago when we started the company, that we decided to build different tools to make research more accessible and interactive. And this tool is Luca. So Luca for us is really about making research into the hands of people who are doing research, be it product manager, be them researcher or designer. We want to make it simple, easy, but also, more importantly, reliable to collect data on the African continent. As you can see, some of the top clients we work with are actually using Luca for doing their quantitative research. So what is it in a nutshell? It's a research platform, so it's a SaaS platform dedicated to Africa. Basically, you have a survey component for your quantitative research. What we call Luca Hub is where we can find existing data that we collect on a current basis, because we notice people are asking often the same question. So why wait for them to go and ask the question? We can ask for them beforehand and give it ready for them to use. And then after, there's the panel if you want to organize your qualitative research. I'll get a bit in more detail, and then after I'll show some examples on how we used it. So basically, Luca Survey is face-to-face, and why doing face-to-face is just because in Africa you have a lot of people who are not tech-savvy, who don't even have a smartphone, to which you cannot push online forms. And having a network of 400 surveyors that we have in 18 countries, for us has been key to help our clients easily understand what's happening in the streets, the behaviors, and having those surveyors really knowing the context has been also very key to make sure the data that comes up of it is really reliable. Outside of that, we also have the capability to do online through the panel that we have available, and pushing a form to the one who are able to use a smartphone. Naturally, there is an app, there is a tech component into that. So you need an app for the researchers that are on the ground so that it's easy for them to collect the data. But you also need an easy way for people who are not experienced researchers or maybe Excel users, but to be able to correlate the data and do some basic presentation of this data. And this is everything we built inside the Luca platform. Luca Hub, as I mentioned, is about, you find a report that interesting you, some specific type of data, you just buy it and you're ready to go. In a few minutes, you have the data that you need to inform the first step of your product development. And if you need more, and if you need more detail or tailor or different geography, then you can go for a more tailored type of survey. And lastly, panel is about, providing you the tool for your qualitative research. Qualitative research, as you all know, could be one-on-one interviews, could be focus group, could be diary studies. But this one, sometimes you can do the research yourself, but you struggle really finding people to do the research with. As we've seen in the data, recruitment is the key issue for UX researcher on the continent. So having access to a panel of reliable people has been it's tremendously useful for most of our clients. So how does it work? Basically, we find people in the panel that we keep growing every month, every week. People, registering for applying to use the panel. Second is profiling, and this is really the peculiarity about running a panel like this on the continent, is that you not only have a form, but you have to do almost small interviews of each person to make sure they are reliable. Otherwise, a lot of people would just apply to the panel to get a bit of money and would not really fit the profile you asked for. And it actually requires a lot of time. Second is the scheduling, and scheduling over here is actually such a challenge as well. You need to make sure people are on time, you confirm, and you always need to have options for them in case you have a non-show of one of your panelists. So basically, a few examples of some clients and companies that do this type of mix between qualitative and quantitative research. The first one we worked recently and this year with is Google, that wanted to understand better the user in Nigeria, in South Africa, and other markets. And for them, it was key to have this two-sided approach, the quantitative approach to understand what's happening in the market that they don't know at all, and also the qualitative approach to inform what could be the ideal features or pain point to solve for their users. And it was, really exciting when we finally been able to see the users of Google and go with their teams on the ground in Lagos to interview users, to see the reaction and differences, and also the complementarity between the different type of data we collected before. Second type of client we do this type of work with is Wikimedia. And Wikimedia is an interesting example because we've been working with them for more than a year right now. And what I really like with Wikimedia is that they don't try to understand everything at the same time. They really focus on very tiny features like the registration process for content creator, for instance, or how you read specific pages. So it's very small chunk of research that you do on a very iterative and continuous basis. And for us, that's the ideal case where you can mix quantitative and qualitative data because you don't have to answer and to ask thousands of questions or dozens of questions. It could be very straightforward. And you can go very fast iterating on each element. We did a very interesting study on Bitcoin usage in Africa. And this one, actually, I took it because it's a case of non-iterative research. We only did it once. But what's fascinating with Bitcoin usage is that it's grown so fast. Every 6 months, it almost doubled. So it's impressive that for some topic, you really need to have a continuous approach and be able not to do a huge research once a year, but be equipped with the different tools and processes and teams to be able to understand how fast the continent is actually moving. And I hope Square understand it. And actually, recently, they recontacted us to use Luca to do their research by themselves on something very specific as well. And we're excited to be able to keep working with them. And recently, we also worked with a unicorn called ShipperCash, based all across the continent, and they wanted to understand how it was working in Francophone Africa. So for these tech giants coming from the Anglophone world, understanding how technology and usage may be in Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire is actually very scary. It seems to them very, very different, not only in the language barrier, but the cultural barrier and the digital behaviors overall. So what we did for them is a mix of quantitative research and qualitative research. Quantitative to understand what were the consumer behaviors and the profile of participants, kind of work on the segmentation and understand what was happening in those two markets. Then we had qualitative research to better understand the pain points, the behavior, the frustration, and the needs so that it could inform the design of the cheaper product on the continent. Then after, ideally, what will be done is like to evaluate all those products and concepts through another round of quantitative research that's much more focused on the ideas that you've been able to generate in the qualitative phase. And you can finally come up with very tailored recommendation for the product that has been tested for the different markets. Some of the deliverable, it's basically using the Luca platform to do correlation. Very rapidly, you can see differences between Abidjan and Dakar, or Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, and really inform key insights, but also follow-up question for your UX research. And that's the beauty to be able to mix quantitative data with qualitative, is that quantitative will show behaviors, but will not tell you why these things are happening. So you can note all these questions and then after ask them in your UX research or qualitative phase. And using the platform Luca for making easy correlation like that on the fly was for us very, very convenient. Second, you can definitely have persona or user profile like that following your qualitative analysis. I'm not going to come back on that. It's probably a tool that you guys use a lot. But what's interesting is that after that, you can mix both qualitative and quantitative data to address a very specific theme. So for instance, if we talk about cross-border money transfer, that is actually not very well documented, or you have no data on Africa on that, you can directly mix the quant and the qual to generate key takeaways, and naturally you have to brainstorm on the opportunities. And at the end, you have a happy user. I love this picture coming from Chipper, because at the end of the day, if we do all those things and we have all this process, is for that. We want to make sure people, whatever type of product they have, can benefit from it and can grow themselves. So key learnings, doing what we do, and I think after that I'll open up to a few questions. But as you probably understood, for us it's very key to do research often, but to reduce the research scopes. So focus on specific features, specific themes. Do it as soon as you have a doubt, as soon as you have a question. Be ready to start some research, and don't make it overcomplicated. And ideally, mix quant and qual to always have the mix between the macro perspective and the micro perspective on your users. Work with local researchers. Naturally, as you can understand, it's not me, Yann, as a Frenchman in Senegal. Even if I speak a bit of Wolof, I don't have a lot of value doing research myself, unless it's in English. But you really need people who speak the local languages, and more importantly, understand the context. This is why you need to have a network of local researchers. And we just listed here a few of the languages you can have in Nigeria, but you have hundreds of them. Same in Kenya, same in South Africa. And this is really one of the key elements about doing research in Africa, is that you need to be able to have people who speak those languages to understand your user. This is a challenge, but there is solutions for that. Train and select for the quality. Researcher for us, goes through a very selective process, and they go through training, because you just don't need people who will fill a form. You need people who will create the empathy with you as user, like a qualitative UX researcher will do, even if they fill forms at the end of the day. And for us, this is a core focus. If you want to make sure you have data of quality, this is where you need to put your focus. Verify data automatically, ideally, because so that you can scale, but don't remove the human aspect of that. For us, it's always been very important to have people looking at the data and try to find inconsistencies in the answer that we have. And we always have data analysts making sure that behind all the automated processes we have, you can also verify the relevancy of the data that come up from the data collection tool. And that's it for me. I hope I wasn't too long and I wasn't too jargonic, and I could enlighten you and also encourage you to do research on this beautiful continent. It's challenging, but it's exciting, and there is so many opportunity. As you know, this is the continent of the future. So I hope all the tools that I shared today will encourage you to build more things that are relevant for the continent. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you. That was really interesting conversation, and kind of looking at some of the challenges that I hadn't foreseen, like the lack of data, just kind of that you can search quickly and look up when you need it. Yeah. Just on questions, we did have one from Alicia asking what are some recent research questions you've worked on, but that was before you went into all of your examples. Yeah. So
there is a lot.
She has said that you answered it, so thanks for that. I have a question, and please, if there's other people watching as well, please do ask your questions as well. You mentioned that specific questions, and you gave the example of Wikimedia and their login flow, or registration, sorry. That's quite easy, I think, for evaluative kind of work. When you're talking about generative, can you give some examples of ways people can be specific when they're starting to look at some generative work?
Absolutely. So one of the key topic I've been working on recently, and actually wasn't in the slide, was agriculture. And agriculture, as you can guess, it employs something between 70 and 80% of people on the continent. So it's not something you can just talk to a farmer and understand everything. You have to understand the entire value chain. So the scope for generative research is like super broad. So where do you start? And so we divided the work in different, what we call use cases. We are different use cases in which the farmers is involved. The first one is, how do you profile a farmer, and how do you make sure the person you have in front of you is actually a real farmer? If you want to provide a service to this person, you need to identify that. Then after, you have to make sure this person is actually producing some crops and procuring. So bringing his tea, for instance, to a collection center is the second step, so that you can actually have a farmer that produce something. And we did a first round of research only on those two elements to understand who are they. Then after, we follow up and focus a bit more on the payment aspects and the financial services. It's only once we've been able to understand that actually you had farmers that will procure crops, a tea, for example, in this case, then you can understand how they want to be paid, by mobile money, on their apps or not, go to the bank, and then also what financial services you can build for them, like basically loans and insurance and everything. And we really divided that step by step, because otherwise you just overwhelm your farmers with tons of questions. And 1 hour in-depth interview is very hard for everyone, but for a farmer, it's even worse. So you need to keep it short as much as you can. Otherwise, you can be sure that the guy is going to just answer to get rid of you. And we had that example at the beginning.
Great. No, that's a great one. Yeah, and then the other question that came up was, I often find value from looking at or having multiple people look at an interview, and because different people pick up on different things. So if you use, are your interviews recorded by any chance, or is there any way that, like, let's say the team who didn't do it will be able to watch the interviews and just see if they can pick up something different?
Yeah, absolutely. And even cooler, what we did for Google, we actually did almost like a happy hour where people were watching users' video. So we will record most of the interviews we do remotely. And in this case, we use Google Meet to have interviews with people in Nigeria and South Africa. And then after, we had this kind of happy hour where people from Google all across the globe were just watching the video we edited from our user. So the hard work over there was to edit the video to make sure we take the most interesting elements that this user was sharing. And I think that works a lot. We also insert those videos into the reports right now, so that it's really live. Naturally, it's when you can do remote interviews with people who are a bit tech savvy. If you interview people on the ground, generally we try to avoid using a camera, because it really breaks the entire relationship. So for instance, with farmers, we never show up with a camera. We may record just the voice, but even if they are agreed to do that. But sometimes we prefer even not to do it, to not risk to have any bias or problem on the side of the farmer. But naturally, all the notes that we have are shared. Most of the time we use tools like Notion or Google Doc, and recently a tool called Notably has been very useful for us to share those different notes to other people part of the team, and then after do the analysis on Miro. Where everyone can see.
Excellent. It's really good, nice mix, and it is always that challenge of do people start playing up to the camera?
Yeah, no, which is always weird. Like the way people behave in front of the camera. I mean, they would prepare a ceremony even, like, so. Yeah. No, there's many challenges.
Great. I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions from people. So now's your last chance if you want to ask Yann anything. And I'll go with one last one. You mentioned that you prepare a kind of a script for your interviews, and then you have the trained interviewers ask them. Do they ever pick up on tangents, or do they always kind of stay with, like, so if somebody gives an interesting answer that you weren't expecting, are they trained to maybe pull on that thread?
Absolutely. This is actually a great feedback, because we didn't thought of it at the beginning, but actually we're surveyors who were really frustrated because they came back with an entire notepad of follow-up insights. It was supposed to be quantitative research and just filling a survey, right? Answer A, B, or C. But then naturally some of them followed up, and they came back with a lot of things. So what we invented is that there is a voice feature in the application where you can even record extra insights via your voice, or even just by tapping the text. So you have at the end of your questionnaire an open text field where the surveyors can add the extra insight. And we train them to do so, because what we really want is to make sure the quantitative research we do is more and more qualitative. So that it goes into the realm of UX research and qualitative research more and more. And also because otherwise it's super frustrating. If you just fill a survey without having a real conversation, you're actually going to get tired very soon.
Great. No, it's great to see that you've covered that use case as well.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. Actually, you need to be an expert to ask this one.
Great. Well, I think that's actually all we have time for. So thank you very much, Yann. I really enjoyed that. And thank you for sharing.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks, Rory, for having us. And I'm open to any question that can come afterwards. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thank you. So up next, we have Ibrahim Ayub, who is the co-founder of Movig. And Ibrahim is going to be talking about empathetic research. Learn more by speaking less. So welcome, Ibrahim. And over to you now.
Great. Thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. I'm Ibrahim, and I do recognize the irony of talking about research and saying to speak less, but I will try to keep it brief and kind of go through this different way about thinking about research and how we conduct basically our methods of understanding users and the people that we're working with. So quick intro. So I'm currently based in Boston. So my focus has been around user research, experience strategy, human-centered design, and I had a cross background across consulting, UX, quite a bit with cultural ethnography and computer science. So a lot of my work ends up being at this kind of intersection between strategy, what are we looking to accomplish, design, how do we really understand the people that we're trying to interact with, technology, how do we enable it, and then adding that kind of cultural lens and element to make sure that we're thinking about these products holistically and inclusively across the different kind of stakeholders and groups. So to kind of set the stage a bit in terms of why even talk about this today, of basically we have seamless connections. About there's no shortage of ways that we can connect with people that we're working with or we're kind of designing for, but it's never been easier to engage. But on the flip side, that there is this kind of fragmented understanding of how do we really get to the core of what people are looking for, especially as designers, product managers, owners, where that responsibility is so high to make sure that we're delivering on the things that people really are looking for. So that's kind of where we are today, and to align a bit on having kind of the central question for the next 20-25 minutes or so on basically this of how do we basically foster deeper understanding of our partners to create more empathetic products and services. And I use partners specifically instead of users, which I'll talk through in a bit, but it's really about that, not just the people that we're designing for, creating products for, but that whole kind of ecosystem around who's involved within the work that we're doing. So with that kind of that challenge, I like to also ground on what are the constraints in which that we try to approach this type of problem, like any design or product problem. And you can think about these kind of three core constraints today. So one of human biases. So grounding in reality today of that we as people are naturally just hardwired to have shortcuts to think through all the stimulus around us, and that's just the nature of how we act. So it's not necessary to think of how do we remove bias when we're doing research, but how to minimize it and address it and recognize it throughout the process. Existing technology as well too. This is not, want to make sure that we're also grounded in the fact that we can't necessarily use something net new, but versus how do we change the way that we're engaging with people through the different tools and services that we currently have at our disposal. And then social dynamics as well, right? To also understand that there are certain things that are kind of ingrained within our society now, for better or worse, that we also need to be cognizant of when we're designing for people who particularly are also may not be so similar in us in terms of kind of behaviors, motivations, and needs and things like that. So these are, kind of the guardrails, I would say, but outside of that, there's, everything is up for grabs. And so that's why I like to think of this kind of empathy playground, around like what's the space that we can work within, and really focusing on those parts to drive the most impact. And I like to start from that of, first, before even getting into certain research methods and tools, is really what's the mindset that we're, as designers, researchers, going into these types of processes, and have kind of four kind of guiding principles of, one of curiosity, right? Being curious of why might people be interacting certain ways, how are they doing it, and having that kind of that lens that we look, kind of zoom in, zoom out to really understand. Holistic. And so this is where we want to not, solely be thinking about product features, specific pain points necessarily, versus how does that whole person kind of interact and engage with the world and environment around them. Third, being collaborative. And so this is also some stuff that Yann touched upon as well, that, thinking about who are the people in the room. The more that we are speaking, the less opportunity we have to actually learn from others as well. So how can we kind of create this co-creation, collaborative type of approach when it comes to research and ultimate design and execution? And then lastly, iterative. That there's no checkbox of I'm empathetic now, or my empathy research is complete, versus something that's continuously has to be done on an ongoing basis, as as products change, as our research changes, as we as individuals and society kind of evolve as well. So as we kind of go through the process or the approach to towards this empathetic research, these are kind of the four mindsets, guiding principles we'll come back to as well, but want to have kind of top of mind as we kind of go through the steps. So the three steps really that lay out here. So one is constructing their mental model. Second, investigating with minimal bias. So again, right, they can't necessarily will never be zero bias, but addressing, recognizing, and kind of minimizing it there. And then reorienting across systems, both the systems of the products and what we're designing, as well as the system of the people the people we're designing for. So step one, constructing their mental model. So this is where a lot of kind of cultural ethnography kind of comes into play. Of we really want to anchor on those that we're serving, and as many of you probably have heard, especially with design, of you're not designing for yourself, you're designing for others, and that we have to, as much as we can, remove ourselves from what we're hearing, and there's this separation between what are we observing versus evaluation. And so, as to the extent that we can, really having those research phase, removing any type of evaluation or analysis to pure raw input of this is what the person is saying, the meaning of it or why, dig into it, but can't say at that point of this is the reason why they feel XYZ, and really thinking about that kind of model from a blank page. We don't want to fit them into our world, our understanding, versus what is an empty canvas that they put them on an empty canvas and then start kind of designing and creating what that worldview looks like. And this is where we're talking about learning more by kind of speaking less, that really understanding and recognizing the power that the words that we have also uses when it comes to kind of creating and understanding mental models. Since the one around just generally a mental structure, basically shaping the way that they see the world, the goals they seek, and choices that they make. And there's a bit of a priming around the language element, but there's a book, Metaphors We Live By, which basically talks about how the different ways that we describe the world, or the metaphors that we're using, can impact, has kind of implicit bias or implicit perceptions of the world. So a couple here of more is up. The idea that it's kind of this vertical idea of around having more. So we think of income is rising, bigger is better. That it goes to this kind of abundance culture where we're we keep wanting more and kind of increasing. Second of time is money. So especially when we're thinking of, as we're designing products or thinking about what needs are, or even marketing them, that a lot of times you hear people say of, we'll save you X number of hours by using this, or, we'll help you better budget your time. But even this idea of time can be, a lot of ways sometimes linear, or also kind of more circular. So that, and also the value that people place on time isn't the same type of value that they would be placing on kind of money or currency. So it comes to these points that we want to minimize the way that we're talking about potential benefits or features and how we describe them. And another example of saying user groups are community, right? If we want to try to foster community with our users, but first, what does community actually even mean for the users? Is that something where it's everyone is extremely well connected and learning from one another, or it's that we, thinking about community as this product or the the service is the leader, and we're kind of following onwards, that it does impact basically the way that they're experiencing the products and services that we have. So kind of goes to the point of the language, the words that we're saying really drives a lot of the impact of how we understand people. So one also specific example of with language impacting how people kind of experience the world with design as well. So the Shona language, they don't have words for red or orange to differentiate between the two colors. So typically people that speak that language don't even see a difference when you have something red versus orange. So this is, one example where if you're designing a color palette or you're creating a product and you have red and orange, for people that speak that type of language, there won't be any specific difference that they're seeing. So you need to be cognizant of when this is, what we're saying and describing, it's going to be different than how the person is kind of perceiving the same kind of the area. And that goes to, again, this not removed from our perspective onto the other person, and really keeping it on observation. And with that in mind, then we can start basically constructing this mental model and doing this type of investigation. And so how to basically do that without saying as much, right? That there's a couple different tools that we can think about. So one is, and this kind of goes to the point around being holistic of, it is what people are saying, but then also getting that full kind of empathy map or affinity map of what are they actually doing, what are they feeling, the thoughts that are kind of going through the person's head as they're potentially using a product, or just kind of they're going through their type of day. And this is, really focusing on observed behaviors, focusing on the words, the things that they are saying, to kind of get that full picture. And there's a couple ways that we can do this, specifically around this idea of language and kind of trying to minimize that type of the bias that can inherently come from how we're speaking. So one is around metaphors. So also taking that idea of metaphors into kind of user research. So one example, for instance, is, let's say you have an e-commerce store or website, and that if you think of, framing it as product search selection is a genie granting wishes, right? So what are those wishes going to look like? What would that be for you? And then you're removing, right, kind of that specific description of, walk me through your experience of going through checkout, for instance, versus now you can kind of get more at the actual end value drivers for the people by kind of framing it, removing it from the product. Second is around visualization. So this kind of removing the speak entirely, where, we've done this in person with people drawing or on Miro, and then having people kind of describe afterwards. But, one example is for internal work. So if you're in HR or thinking about employee experience, especially now with hybrid models of where people are working, sometimes in person, sometimes remote, that example could be of, imagine the employees are on a bus. What does it look like? And this, there's a lot of interesting insights that comes out of this, where, do people describe, where are people sitting on the bus, for instance, right? Are people sitting by department? Does everyone have their own seat? Are, people grouped by when they join, seniority? Who's driving the bus? Where's the bus going? How many people are driving it? These types of things, you can start to understand more of, how are employees kind of thinking about their experience with work and with their colleagues, which again kind of drives more insights than asking of, do you want an open floor plan or a closed floor plan? What type of kind of company culture do you want? These are, ways that you can kind of get to those through a more scenic route, but does kind of minimize some of the inherent bias in terms of how we ask the questions. And it also goes, to power dynamics and kind of things like that. If they think of CEO or executives only as the one driving, and employees have no idea where it's going, or things like this. And then lastly on surveys. So this kind of goes to that point around the abundance culture as well. But a lot of times that when it's not possible to do in-person sessions, or inherently there's a lot of surveys that will be done to facilitate also user research, thinking about the framing of those questions as well. So for instance, this, rating something on a scale of -5 to +5 versus 0 to 10, both have the same number of options. But if we're thinking of this kind of the abundance culture of 0 to 10, we're looking just straight at magnitude, and that 4 may mean one thing, versus if we're saying -5 to +5, then we're getting a distinction between what is overall negative sentiment versus what might be the magnitude of interest, for instance. So these, again, sometimes can feel like small kind of points, but then when we're really trying to understand, especially with surveys, a broad audience, that these are the kind of things that we want to think about of how are we framing the questions in a way, and what might be the different interpretations that people might have as they kind of go through each of them. So as we kind of go through these different types of exercises and ways to kind of have that more empathy-driven research, then the third step of kind of reorienting across systems as well. So there's two kind of frames of this. The first is our people, right? So not just was mentioning before, not just the users, where the way that people are interacting with a product as a user is just one very small part of their overall life, but then thinking more of what are the the different dimensions and layers of that person. So the kind of overall patterns, trends, events that are that we're seeing on top, but then also underlying with structural, institutional, and those mental models that we talked about before, where this kind of gives more a complete picture of the people that we're serving. And I mentioned the another example for this, for instance, is around social media, where right now I'm launching a startup within doing a lot of work with content creators, and there's obviously very different perceptions or ideas around social media, kind of attention economy and things like this. And that when we're speaking to people, particularly who are a lot of creators who are moms, that their own experience with their work as a creator, we found there's impact when they have children, and then they see certain studies, reports about the impact of their kind of attention and development, which are things that obviously then impact how they would be interacting with our product or any social media products. So these are things which only focusing on the product you wouldn't necessarily get, but having that full kind of complete picture provides a more holistic view and understanding. And then once we, first anchor on the person, then we can more appropriately look at the product. Oops, sorry about that. The product itself. So there's, the product, and we think of, the journey map, the kind of specific interactions, but then also what are the other products or services that they're using within, or as a complementary of ours, and then the environment that they're in as well. So examples here of when, are people using your product when they're more on the move versus sitting down, for instance, for mobile apps, where this is going to then impact, how much you want people really focusing, sitting, looking at the product if they're, walking on the street, things like this, versus, sitting down and have more time to kind of go through in depth. And one example, if you use CarPlay, like Apple CarPlay for when you're driving, that you'll see with Spotify has a different view when they see that you are driving. Make things bigger, also minimize the amount of stimuli and data that's being presented, because I recognize that you are driving. Right? So that's something that we want to be cognizant about. How we're designing our product is not just the specific buttons, but it's more broadly, again, and where the person is in that environment as well. And so some specific, some other kind of design leadership of, as we kind of think about this holistically, is one, target customers and market entry and expansion of the customers that we are designing for, that who do we have a really clear understanding of the cultural impact and kind of considerations that come into play with any new market. And as we kind of go through that execution, who's actually involved, is the customer's voice being heard? And if it's not being heard, who is transmitting it? And what are the steps that are kind of diluting that initial source as well, right? So this also that, Yann had mentioned as well too, that there's going to be, there are research analysis and kind of synthesis that will kind of get to certain insights, but then the different perspectives that are providing that type of input will, provide better, more holistic view of it. And then from design as well, so we might mention kind of colors in terms of, from one extreme that people may not even differentiate between red and orange, but also from a cultural perspective, we think of orange as kind of a hazard in the US, but in certain parts of Asia, it's seen associated with positivity, spiritual enlightenment. So here we have to think about what are multiple signals that we can kind of reinforce, what we're actually trying to convey to customers, because they may have different interpretations or understanding of it. And images, obviously, and kind of navigation as well. So a lot of things to kind of think about as we're kind of going through the process. And I'll quickly kind of wrap up of, right, we're in constant state of evolution. So this is never a final check. That is kind of, think about as we are verbs, obviously not nouns. So that having one, recognizing that there is a lot of ways a lot that needs to be done to understand people, but that understanding never kind of ends. So we want to, kind of recognize that as we kind of move forward. And I'll give a kind of quick, some quick examples of what this looked like in practice with our startup of movig, basically a business suite for creators to manage the back office of all of their work. So some of the things that I think we had done well from kind of empathy driven side of, one, recognizing that creators, even what does kind of the business side look like for them, where for small, medium businesses or enterprises, think very kind of clearly around, okay, this is sales, this is, projects, this the payments. Whereas for them, we didn't initially frame our research around that. We framed it more around, what are your goals for this type of work? What are the areas that you're spending, X amount of time on? And then ended up wrapping it, around the kind of the business side of things. And second, around visual cues. So this was, again, that there was a bit of a separation between, or understanding that there, as creators, very creative type thinking, as thinking visually, that we kind of reinforced that with how we were designing, conveying the information around, these more kind of business focused topics. then reinforcing this idea of the journey. So we saw that it was that kind of what that overall journey of with being a creator, how that also is complemented with their own kind of personal journey, that some of people are doing this part-time and focused a lot of the kind of the business metric success not on how much revenue you're making, but the consistency of your routines to enable kind of the goals that they had from this area. And some of the lessons learned. So one of around kind of time commitments, that this was it was very varied for different people, that we had to make sure they recognize that their vision of success is very different based off of the other stuff that they had going on. And then these kind of educational resources that was much more important than we kind of initially realized. So kind of having that education kind of more integrated throughout as well, and reinforcing that that those routines. So to wrap up here, so some of the key takeaways of when the outputs kind of depend on the nature of our inputs, right? So how we're kind of approaching research, who's in the room, thinking about the language, what we're actually speaking, how that impacts kind of empathetic leadership and research throughout, and recognizing that is a constantly evolving situation. So we need to one, construct their mental models, kind of go through this type of investigation, trying to minimize bias as much as we can, and then kind of continuously zooming in, zooming out to kind of get that full picture, and then repeat the process as much as possible. So that's it for today. Would love to stay connected, and thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you, Ibrahim. That was a really interesting talk. I love the color example, because I hadn't heard that one about orange and red. I've heard ancient languages, they found no description of blue up until kind of modern times. So people would describe the sea as dark wine because they didn't have a color blue to describe it with. So it's very interesting to see how kind of language influences things.
Yeah.
So yeah, if anybody has any comments or questions, please do share them, and I'll ask them to Ibrahim. But I'll start with one. So that was a great kind of deep dive into trying to understand the mental model of kind of a particular person. But what if you have, let's say, multiple personas or multiple different kind of user groups for your product? Do you recommend kind of trying to do it for each? And then where do you draw the line? As in, do you have a persona of one, or how do you draw a grouping around your personas?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think it partly depends on kind of where, if it's a net new, you're starting a new research project, or this is kind of later on where personas have been developed. Typically what we like to do is basically using the mental models to inform the personas as well, so that the personas are less around certain kind of interactions with products or other services, versus that the people that kind of have a similar value system, for instance, we would want to treat them in one way, kind of in that persona A. And then so using that kind of as one of the inputs, and then there's also a bit of a separation of that first kind of understanding of these are three kind of groups of people that typically think X, Y, Z in different ways. But then when it goes to the product of then we need to design feature A, B, C, like having a social component, for instance. Then it goes a bit into the messaging of like, how is that being conveyed to group A versus group 2? And there could be some overlap there, but it's typically the separation of one is like, these people generally kind of think and behave the same way. And then second of, then we think, how do we kind of address them from a product perspective, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so it's I guess you need to just look at your product and then determine where the right boundaries are. But then once you have those boundaries, follow your advice of kind of getting into the head of constructing the mental models of those people.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. I think that's actually all we have time for. So just want to thank you very much for sharing. I hope everybody out there enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you once again, Ibrahim.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Great. So that's actually all we have time for today. I'm just going to finish up very quickly with a quick plug for if you did enjoy the talks today. We do also host conferences around the world. So we have one in the USA in New York in May, and we're also having another conference in Dublin in October. So it'll be a lot more people, 25 plus speakers at USA. We'll have 8 workshops where you can get detailed hands-on with some of these topics. There'll be 800 attendees, and we always look for that kind of product team. So it's product managers, UX researchers, designers, and developers. So people who can kind of learn about how to better work as a product team. So please do join us. We have an early bird discount on at the moment. So use up your last end of year budget before it gets wasted. But that's enough of a plug for me. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the session and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.